just as a housekeeping note, I hope you have your phones with you and your apps ready because we're going to try test out this interactive polling feature that has been advertised for the conference. So get your apps ready, and in a few minutes we'll come back with a few polls, questions to get us kicked off here for this panel. So my name is Tom Kerr. I lead climate change policy at the IFC in Washington. I've been heavily involved in the carbon pricing discussion the past several years, and have been watched as this has evolved quite rapidly. We've seen a real big movement, particularly among the private sector. I think you might even say there's become a slogan you could put on a t-shirt, put a price on carbon. You hear this a lot from companies around the world as they are really realizing that this is one of the key strategies that will help them to sort of have predictability and plan their investments in the future. And they have been really leading, in fact, in a lot of cases, ahead of the governments in terms of how they're putting a price on carbon. So we've got a really excellent panel today, a very interesting mix of companies from a variety of sectors that are obviously impacted by climate change, but are taking leadership positions to advance carbon pricing within their own operations, but also in larger advocacy discussions. So what we're going to do, I'm going to just have a few slides to set the scene. Then I'm going to come to ask each speaker. We'll do a poll question or two, and then I'll come back to each one of the panelists and ask them to make an introductory statement. So if you could put up the first slide for me, please, I'll get started with that. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's been a huge momentum and change in carbon pricing. I don't know, most people don't realize that over almost 70 jurisdictions globally are now using some form of carbon pricing. This map here comes from the World Bank Group's annual State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report. They're tracking these developments around the world. And just some quick highlights I think that people maybe don't realize is first, if you quantify the market value of the existing systems today, the market value is over $50 billion each year being generated. This is in either tax revenues or in allowance revenues from a cap and trade scheme. And this goes in contrast, or maybe to complement, the discussions we're having in the UN context around $100 billion for climate finance. So there's a significant amount of money that's being generated each year in these systems. We have then a growth in jurisdictions that are putting forward proposals for carbon pricing. You can see a lot of action in Latin America, and I'm really happy we have a panelist today from Brazil. But in fact, just this week, we got a news item from Argentina that has just introduced a $25 a ton carbon tax. The finance minister has introduced that new price. But Colombia has recently put in place a carbon tax, as well as Chile and Mexico, and others are moving forward very quickly in that part of the world. Coming over here to Asia, people have been watching China. We know that we've had a very large set of pilots going on with pilot schemes in China for a few years now. And those price levels have been roughly $2 to $8 a ton. But they're about to introduce a national cap and trade scheme, and people have been watching to see when that will happen. That will be the largest cap and trade scheme in the world. But in addition, we have Singapore that is working on a new carbon tax that should be put in place in the next few years, as well as South Korea and Vietnam. So there's a lot of momentum on the government side, and I think if you look at the pledges made for Paris, almost half of the countries have put in place, they've indicated they want to use carbon pricing as one of their strategies. So then the next slide tells you what the corporate response has been. So as I mentioned, in some cases, the companies are leading the government. So we have over 1,400 companies around the world now are either using an internal carbon price or plan to do so in the next 2 years. This slide's a little bit hard to read the exact the names and things, but I guess the size of the triangle should indicate that's the number of companies per jurisdiction that are indicating they're using an internal carbon price. And while Europe is the largest sort of triangle there, and North America is second, we've seen the CDP that tracks this data has seen the largest growth in Asia, particularly in India and China, where I think companies are now seeing this as part of a sort of corporate strategy to prepare for a carbon-constrained future. And so there's been a rapid growth in this uptake. And we'll hear today on the panel, what is the motivation to do this in advance of regulation? And the other thing that is interesting factoid from the CDP data is that many of the prices that companies are using are higher prices than we're seeing globally. And so I think the final point on this, the slides here, is that while this momentum is fantastic, it's not enough. I think the average price of the carbon pricing that's in place by governments today is under $10 a ton, and only about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions have a price on them. And so that's why we're here today, to dive into this a little deeper, to see what are companies thinking about in terms of getting ready for this carbon-constrained future, and what challenges and opportunities do they see. So now I'd like to go to the poll. And so if we can pull up the first question, which is, what sector are you active in? I don't know if this is, if you have on your app, you can go to this session here, and you can click on which sector you're in. So we'd like to see which sectors are represented in the room here today. So this will be, I think, updated in real time as we go forward, as people type in their answers. Interesting to see the finance sector is represented well. And I guess if we had our panelists were able to answer, we'd see manufacturing going up, but there we go. There's a few folks from the manufacturing sector. Interestingly, IFC is a finance provider as well, and we are seeing the banks we're talking with are looking at this as well, carbon pricing as a strategy they might be using. Okay, so let's go to the second question, which is, what are you currently using a carbon price today? So this is a yes or no question. So we'll give people a minute here to respond to that one. Okay, so it looks about 2/3, a little more than 2/3 is not using a price today. But again, I think that's interesting to see that we have a good portion is already using a price. Okay, so that's the first poll. I'll come back to the poll in a second. I think that then I'd like to now turn to the panel and maybe just for an introductory statement. I'll start with Ulhas Yargap, who is the group president and group CTO of Mahindra Group. They have been a real leader in carbon pricing. And Ulhas, I know you've been really innovating and thinking about your sort of, how does a carbon price help you deliver some of your larger climate change and sustainability goals? So if you can talk about that a little bit, that'd be great.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. How the carbon pricing helps us to deliver on some of our goals. Essentially, let me first talk about what our carbon pricing is. So we have declared about a year ago that we will invest $10 for every ton of carbon that we emit in our operations. So what it does is it has established very real, transparent and internal carbon pricing. And it's real because we actually invest that money in technologies that will reduce our future carbon emissions. That number is known internally to everyone in the company, it is within our company, so it's not anything to do with external stakeholders. I think the biggest benefit of that, as far as I can see, is to really get everyone focused on this issue, get everyone to start thinking about it, and some of our internal processes for approving the kinds of investments we make have suddenly become much easier for the champions who are trying to make them happen, because everybody recognizes that as a company we are committed to doing these things. So, some of the earlier processes or hurdles that people had to go through, I think have basically become much easier to cross. Let me see, did I miss out on anything? What this has also done is it has allowed us to increase the levels of investments we've been making. We started out making investments of about $4 per ton, and that was before we had announced a carbon price. Then it went up to $7. Now that we've declared a $10 price, we are committed to investing at least that amount of money, and so we make sure that we do that or more. And the kind of projects that we've been investing in over the last several years have helped us to reduce our specific energy consumption by 63% over a period of time. And some of the examples of the projects we've done are LED lighting, which have obviously a very quick payback. We've invested in wind and solar power. In our factories, we have done a lot of heat recovery, waste heat recovery type projects. We've switched over from diesel to LPG wherever possible. We've replaced some of our existing electric motors with higher efficiency motors, and we do a lot of projects for converting our buildings into green buildings, or when we do build new buildings, they're always at the certified levels of platinum or gold or whatever. So all of these things count, but I think the last thing I want to say is that so far, really in my view, we are going after the low-hanging fruits, and I think what carbon pricing allows us to do is really to set up the processes and the internal infrastructure to go after more ambitious goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think that theme, I'd like to just park that, because I think it's a very important point you make, that what we hear many times is that, as you say, the price sort of changes this from being sort of a sustainability department target to a group-wide target that's owned by everyone. So I think that's a very interesting point to highlight. So our next panelist, I'm going to turn to Marina Matar. She is the Director of Institutional Relations and Sustainability with the Brazilian Association of the Chemical Industry, or it's also called ABIQUIM. So Marina has maybe won the award for the farthest distance traveled here to our conference, and we're really happy to have her with us. But they've been doing some fascinating things in Brazil with corporates. The government has not introduced a carbon price yet, but the companies are leading on that. And so I wanted to introduce Marina to talk a bit more about that.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, to cross the world and follow this discussion. And I learned a lot with you. Following yesterday, the discussions, it was very interesting. And first, I would like to tell you why the chemical sector is involved in this discussion. It's interesting because I am not from the chemical sector. I didn't study chemistry. I took my master's, and my master's final paper was about climate refugees. So after I finished my master's, I got a job offer to work in the chemical sector. And it's amazing how ignorant I was about the importance of the chemical sector to our lives, because the chemical products are everywhere, are in our clothes, in the water we drink, everywhere. So that's why we say the chemical sector is the industry of the industries, because we create solutions to all other industrial sectors. So with the chemical solutions, we can help the automotive sector, for instance, to produce lighter cars with more plastics that uses less fuels and emit less. Or in agrochemical, we can help to have more sustainable, more efficient seeds with the crop protection, for instance. So it's very important for to combat hunger, to end the hunger problem in a growing world. So many other solutions, like for electric cars, there's the lithium battery, the chemical industry is involved. So that's why we are so involved in this discussion now, because we believe the chemical sector is an important actor in this process, as we can help to create solutions to other industrial sector. And the carbon pricing, for us, it's one of the most important tools, and it's a great opportunity for the companies to innovate and to be more competitive in a sustainable way. We have to, as Stone said in the beginning, carbon pricing is an irreversible trend. So if the companies want to keep their competitiveness, they must be involved in this discussion and be prepared for that. As Stone mentioned, we don't have carbon pricing in Brazil yet, And this discussion is not in the ministry's level and even not in the presidential level yet, but the technical teams of the government is already very specialists. They're discussing a lot with the Partnership for Market Readiness, which is a World Bank initiative. And the discussion is growing, but the companies are being prepared for this for a long time. In Brazil, the chemical industry was the first industrial sector to have a formal position on carbon pricing. We are asking for carbon pricing, more specifically carbon market, because in Brazil we have already a lot of taxes. But if the government decides for taxes, like the other neighboring countries in South America, we are asking for carbon neutrality. And also, there are 7 points that we are asking for the government as the chemical industry. One is to recognize the historical actions and efforts of the industries to reduce emissions. In the last 10 years, the chemical industry in Brazil reduced 29% of the CO2 voluntarily. Also to establish a timeline and a strategy on the theme, on the subject in Brazil until 2018 in order to implement this policy from 2020, so that industries have some time to get prepared and get used to this new instrument. Also the carbon market, as I mentioned, we prefer carbon markets than taxes, and to integrate Brazilian policies to other country and region policies. As Tom mentioned, Argentina just announced a type of carbon pricing for the energy sector. There are other countries in the South America and also Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and they're also already discussing the possibility of having a carbon market in the Pacific Alliance countries. So the discussion is growing very fast in the South America, and we are following this. Although Brazil has no position yet, we are getting prepared for that. So the other 2 points that we are asking for the government is to harmonize Brazilian climate and energy policies and to ensure a high level of governance by the government. Because the ministries, they're having different level of discussions. The Ministry of Industry, they're getting involved now, and we are pushing them to be involved because it's very important. I saw the Ministry of Industry in India, from India yesterday, and it's amazing the speech he gave. I really liked. And it's nice to see that the Ministry of India is involved as well, not only the Ministry of Environment or the Finance. In Brazil, it's more concentrated in the Finance Ministry. So the simulation that we have, it's the 3rd year that they are implementing. We are starting the 4th year already. The rules were created in 2013, and there are many sectors involved, almost 50 companies already. So from the sectors chemical, petrochemical, electric, agriculture, mining, banking, construction, steel, timber, ceramics, paper, cosmetics, cement, aeronautical, retail, ethanol, sanitation, logistics, glass. So many different sectors, 50 companies already. And it's interesting because they have this they simulate the transaction. So there is an institute, and they made fictitious financial resources, and the emissions data is real. The emissions data are real from the companies. They are covering scope 1 of the emissions of the participant companies. And there is an advisory board, which is composed by national and international experts who contribute to the strategic decision making. This simulation is made inside a university. The name is Fundação Getúlio Vargas. And that's why it's important the companies to work together with universities in this. We always say that sustainable development is just shared responsibility with academy, industries, private sector, government, and civil society. Right. It's not something just for the industry. So it's something that it's working very well, and I can share later with you when you open for the questions.
Great. No, so just so you, I don't know if you, just to clarify that, so there's almost 50 Brazilian companies that have voluntarily agreed to cap their emissions, and they're trading to simulate how that would work, to see what the price levels might be, and then to share the experience with the government and say, here are some design considerations that we're learning as part of this simulation. So I think that's, again, let's hope we can come back to some of that. So now I'd like to turn to Mr. Mahendra Singhi, and I believe he has a slide as well we'd like to pull up. He is the CEO of the Dalmia Bharat Cement Group and has been a real champion. I just saw him 2 weeks ago in Bonn at the COP discussions. And he has a really excellent story to talk about sort of the journey of a company along the sort of the green pathway for a cement company in India. So please.
Thanks, Tom. Ladies and gentlemen, happy morning. Let me introduce my company. We are in the business of creating economic growth with sustainability practices. We try to serve the society which needs housing, infrastructure, industry by providing green cement. We are 25 million ton cement company which has grown with a CAGR growth of 22% in last 10 years, and at the same time fully conscious of its social responsibilities also. For highlighting how carbon has been important for us, let me highlight our vision and philosophy. Our vision is to be leader in building materials and to create and to evoke pride in all stakeholders through customer centricity, innovation, sustainability and values. And the philosophy which drives us is clean and green is profitable and sustainable. So we have taken this business unusual growth in which we have to work on profitability also along with sustainability. Now with this approach, we have started managing carbon. Many of you must be knowing that global cement sector emits almost 6% of CO2 globally. But at the same time, there are ways and means by which you can bring down CO2 emissions and at the same time continue to produce cement. Now, with this philosophy, what we thought is that whatever we measure, we can monitor. Whatever we monitor, we can focus, and whatever we focus, we can achieve objective. So I would just like to show by one slide that what we did. Can you just show this? So ladies and gentlemen, you'll find that we decided that the more you bring down your CO2 emissions, the more you become profitable, the more you become sustainable. And then we identified what are the best practices which can create these results. And you would find that if you compare with global cement average, which is more than say 600 kg per ton of cement, good part is that Indian cement sector is better than global cement companies, and this global cement companies figures represents almost 40% of global capacity other than China. Now, Indian cement sector also is represented almost 65% of the capacity in these figures, which are the most efficient cement companies. Then our group is having less than 500 numbers, which is one of the best, and our East operation, which fortunately also, incidentally also, has been financed by IFC, that produces the lowest carbon footprint, and we say with pride that we produce cement with the lowest carbon footprints globally. So the purpose of this is to remain sustainable also and remain profitable also. This has ensured also that we have become one of the most profitable cement company in India, and now we are thriving that how to bring down more and more CO2 emissions so that we can conserve mineral resources, we can conserve energy, we can conserve water. Let me also share that it's not just the energy which we are conserving, as we have become one of the most energy efficient cement company also, but at the same time, we have concentrated on water. We have tried to harvest water whatever is possible, and today we can say that we are water positive. It means we harvest more water than what we consume. Now, considering that how to create focus on carbon, so we have started carbon pricing methodology internally. We created a shadow price of $11 few years back, and then what we saw is that the various projects which are not viable because of very low IRR. Normally, with our capital allocation policy, IRR should be 20% or more, then only we should execute the project. But if those projects which can help us in bringing down IRR, which are having low IRR, but if we add carbon pricing, that can achieve maybe 20-22% IRR, then let that be good. So our board decided that yes, we can include carbon pricing also as one of the factor in finance to evaluate the projects which otherwise cannot be done. And we are happy that various such projects which otherwise had 7-8 years payback period or maybe 12%, 13% IRR could be executed, and that is what made us one of the lowest power consuming cement company. Say like our average is 69 kWh per ton of cement with a global average of maybe 90 plus. Now, with this carbon pricing, the projects which were not viable in a big way, say like capital intensive waste heat recovery projects, the cogen project, that we could execute. Now, important part is that financial institutions, banks, they are not considering carbon pricing as one of the factors to evaluate the projects. So more and more those efforts have to be done by banks, by financial institutions, that if they consider such carbon reduction projects with the inclusion of carbon pricing, then it should be possible for them also to finance those projects. Now, if we look back and we see certain CDM projects which were there as per Kyoto Protocol, many countries, developing countries, which were China, India, Brazil, and many countries, they did a lot of such projects because of CDM projects, because of carbon pricing being paid by developed world. Since last few years, those projects have stopped. So now, carbon pricing has to be now considered by developed world also for developing country, and they must finance these projects. Now, in addition to this, let me also say that we are working on various sustainability development goals also, and that helps us in understanding the total societal value, what we are doing. We are also in the process of now measuring various capitals like natural capital, like societal capital, like environmental capital, like intellectual capital. So that would also help us in understanding that what's the impact of business on overall society.
Great.
So in my view, yes, internally companies should consider carbon pricing to understand that whether it will make bigger sense or not.
That's great.
And lastly, I may share that because of this carbon pricing philosophy, as well as visualizing that ultimately we have to bring down CO2 emissions, we have decided that by 2030, our company should be using 100% renewable energy. And we became the member of RE100. In India, there are just 3 companies, Tata Motors, Infosys, and the third company, Dalmia Cement. And globally also, there are 100 companies only who have so far committed to go for 100% renewable energy, and our company is only the global cement company.
Well, congratulations, sir. That's really a great story. It's really, every time I hear you explained it, I think pick up another detail of how really impressive that is, the sort of journey you've been on. And I think the key thing is to highlight the role of the pricing to kind of make this a decision-making tool internally. So you can now justify it, you can go to your board, and they're behind that fully. So that's a fantastic story to share, and look forward to hearing more about that. So let's go back to our final panelist, to Sanjeev Paul, who is the Vice President for Safety, Health, and Sustainability with Tata Steel Limited. So rounding out the panel with another material provider. I know you're right now thinking about how do you use a carbon price to sort of achieve your sustainability targets. We'd love to hear from you where you're at right now and what challenges you're facing.
Thank you, Tom, and it's a pleasure to be here. Like Mr. Singhi, in fact, I could say ditto to quite a lot of things that he said. So, most of my job is done. Thank you, Singhi sir. Like cement, steel also is today probably contributing to 6 to 7% to global CO2 emissions. And if business goes on as usual, scientists believe that by 2040, the contribution of steel to global emissions would be 30-35%. And this is primarily because some of the bigger contributors like power, mobility, who are bigger contributors today, would have come down to almost zero. Those sectors would have gotten decarbonized, a lot because of what we heard yesterday with what is happening to the price of renewable energy, with what is happening to the price of storage of energy, with a parallel session going on electrical vehicles, so short distance mobility to a large extent would get decarbonized by that time. But there is no such technology in sight which could fully decarbonize steel, and I suspect something similar with cement as well. So these are sectors which scientists believe are hard to abate. Tata Steel is socially and environmentally very a responsible corporate, and we have been like this for the last 110 years. And going forward, looking at the challenges that the world is facing with climate change, we are also looking at how to reduce our carbon footprint. Today, an average integrated steel plant produces around 2.5 to 2.7 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of crude steel. With no technology in sight to fully decarbonize this, what we can actually be doing is to improve our efficiencies. And carbon pricing is a wonderful mechanism of ensuring some of the technologies which were not being able to come up because of the hurdles, the weighted average cost of capital hurdles that we put in to make them financially viable. Now, with this pricing are being able to see the light of day, and we have been able to implement. This is a policy that we implemented just 9 months ago. We have put in a carbon price of $15, and that is the shadow price that we have taken internally. And we have seen the kind of benefit that it is now beginning to provide us. We'll continue to monitor how this moves going forward till 2020, and then we'll have a review as to whether this is the right price and how is the world going around this kind of pricing, and maybe enhance it subsequently. So that is our story on carbon pricing as of now. We feel that the time has come for us now, for everybody globally, to look at putting a price to carbon and to prop up technologies which will mitigate the impact of emission of CO2s in the atmosphere.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I agree that it's a very important point to make about how the decarbonization pathway is very clear on the transport and the power sectors now, but then for the heavy industry, getting to deliver sort of baseload power and heat for your processes with what we have today, technologies, is going to be a big leap. And I think that's the question that a lot of people are asking. What is the role of getting on that pathway, and what's the role of pricing and sort of delivering? How much does that cost, and who's going to pay for that? I think that's a really very important point. So now let's go back to the polling. After the first round, if we can pull up the question, what carbon price level, dollar per ton of CO2, will be needed in India and South Asia to achieve climate targets between now and 2030? So again, that's what price level will be needed to achieve climate targets. And I think this is question number 3 for the poll team. So it's less than 10, 10 to 30, 30 to 50, or over 50. So we're seeing a convergence, 10 to 30. I think, interestingly, we had Nicholas Stern yesterday on one of the panels, and they had just come out with a study that said, I think we need 40 to 80 by 2020 globally to be on the Paris pathway. And so we're not too far from that perception here, it seems, in India. I'm going to skip the next question for the poll, and I want to go to the question, what business rationale is most likely to drive your use of an internal carbon price? If we can pull up that poll question, I think that's a really interesting one I'd like to explore with this next round of interventions. So again, what business rationale is most likely to drive your use of an internal carbon price? I think it's the question number 5. Not this one, the next one, if you don't mind. And so the possible answers here are preparing for higher carbon other energy taxes, like the coal cess. 2, mitigating possible impact risk, so concerns about flooding or supply chain disruption. To steer investment towards lower carbon business lines and operations, or to respond to investors' questions. So this is interesting. So I think, there's sort of that risk and opportunity background. So on the first, I think you're getting ready for possible risks to your business model, additional costs you have to absorb. But I think interestingly, it looks here, there's a very optimistic view here in India where people are seeing that as they adopt a price, this is helping them to become a leaner, meaner, more competitive operator. And actually, one great anecdote there is, I don't know if people have followed the company Microsoft is using a carbon fee program. And they recently just changed that where now some of the money from that carbon fee is being collected to go towards new business lines that they see as a growth opportunity. So based on that, Ulhas, I'd like to come back to you. You told a good story about your journey so far in terms of adopting the carbon price and getting it to be more internal governance and approach. So what's next for Mahindra Group in terms of carbon pricing? Where do you see you heading with using the carbon price and your larger corporate strategy?
The first thing that I expect to happen is that more and more companies within the group will adopt a carbon price, because so far only the flagship company has done so, and I think there's opportunity for everyone to do that. The second thing that I'm personally very much looking forward to is, the kind of trade-offs that Mr. Singhi talked about. That in our everyday business decisions, if we can get to a point where people can make a trade-off between, how they can use carbon pricing to decide between investments. And I think right now, when we look at such decisions, maybe we are not really seeing that many technology options. So to some extent, it's also a question of what different options are available and where you can actually make the trade-off and decide, what's going to make the best sense. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the prerequisite for any of this to happen is that people should have a common vocabulary related to carbon pricing. And I think to that extent, it's very useful if there are common metrics that evolve and that can be used across industry, because then it becomes much easier. Like in India, you have all the air conditioners or refrigerators, they have the star system. You have 5 stars or 4 stars. It tells you how efficient they are. So similarly, in manufacturing operations or in any other operations, if we could evolve some kind of a rating system that's easy for people to understand and relate to, I think it'll just make it that much easier to sell the concept internally or externally. And I was looking at the last poll you did. Personally, I think the surest way to get companies to commit to carbon pricing is if they believe that at some point in the future there's going to be some kind of a regulatory impact of carbon pricing. So because everyone can see the value in getting prepared for something that's coming, I'm not so sure if it's that easy to sell people on the idea of, that they just need to do it because it's a good thing. Because whether it's the bankers who finance them or the finance people who evaluate the projects, they have to see some tangible reason to support that. Then of course, the other things that we would love to do, we are already making electric cars, and I would love to see progress on the technologies that will help us sort of move to lower carbon type activities. I think these are basically the kinds of things that I can think.
That's great. Yes, yeah. So I think it's a nice segue then to Marina with your point about seeing regulation coming. So Marina, you've talked a bit about how the government is at a technical level exploring options, but you see sort of you're being surrounded now by different countries that are looking to price carbon. So what do you see next in Brazil? You've had this simulation, you've had a growing group of companies that are sort of asking the government for carbon pricing, but what do you see next in Brazil?
Yeah, I see next in Brazil the elections.
Yeah.
Next year we have the presidential elections. So I don't think we're going to have, I may be wrong, but I don't think we are going to have a policy for carbon pricing the next year, because they will all be concentrated in the elections. But on the other side, we must be prepared, and we are discussing with the government a lot this irreversible trend, and the fact that our neighboring countries are already implementing the policies. So if they have policies for that, the companies are already investing in low carbon technologies. And what we are saying to Brazilian government is the risk of becoming technology lagged, because if we have a carbon pricing policy only to 2020 or in the future, when we have it, all the other neighboring countries and the companies there, they will be in a very advanced process of technology, low carbon technology, and we might have the risk of importing the technologies from them, because we don't have a specific policy from the government supporting the industries to invest in those technologies. And yesterday in one of the discussions I found very interesting, because one of the speakers said it's important to emphasize that we are not asking to the government to have a benefit. We have to ask to the government to find solution together. We don't want benefit, it's a shared responsibility. So we have to find a way to have a solution. In Brazil, we have a very ambitious target in the NDC. It's one of the most ambitious, I think. Our target is to reduce by 2025, 37% of our emissions, and by 2030, 43%. In India, I think your target is 33 to 35 by 2030. So our target is even more ambitious. And seeing the other neighboring countries in a very advanced process, while we have this target for 2025, it's a bit scary, because we cannot waste the opportunity of getting involved in this technology process. And also, as I mentioned before, it's important to have work closely with the academia. It's a reskilling process that is needed now. The students must be reskilled for this new reality. Up to now, when we discussed sustainability, we've just discussed about ecology, but not too much about economy. But sustainability has 3 pillars, and economy must be considered as well. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So the students must be stimulated to develop research focused on low carbon technology, and work together with the industry and the government in this new scenario.
That's great. So I wanted...
I'd like to say
yeah, please.
something.
Yeah.
I think that's a very important point that Marina made about different stakeholders need to work together. And I believe that there's great need within India to have some kind of a think tank that will think about climate change related policies and advise government, industry, or different other stakeholders.
That's a good, really good point. I agree. And I also wanted to come back to your point about competitiveness in the region. I think that's a fascinating story, because what's happening in Canada is another really interesting example, where Canada has put on a carbon price floor of $50 per ton by 2020. And we've had, interestingly, many of the provinces have had carbon pricing in place for a few years now. And if you hear the industry, our partners that are in this carbon pricing leadership coalition they're saying that they want to become carbon competitive. That's a new sort of metric. And they want to export these solutions to America. And so it's a very interesting dynamic you're seeing there in terms of, as you say, do you want to be a taker or a provider of the solutions?
Yes.
So thank you for highlighting that, Marina. Mr. Singhi, let's come back to you in terms of, so you've put out this goal. I think the renewable energy, 100% renewable energy target is your next challenge.
Yes.
What's next for you with the carbon price and the link to this renewable energy target? What do you see as sort of what help do you need from us?
Yes. First, just let me share that Indian government, they are fully conscious of to create consciousness, to create awareness in the Indian corporate world. And one big thing which they did was they brought in one philosophy of PET, perform, achieve, and trade. That was moved by Ministry of Energy, and there they saw in 3 years that 31 million ton of CO2 got reduced. That was one way of ensuring that yes, if some companies doesn't perform, then they may have to pay penalty. And at the same time, if some company performs better, then they may get some bonus. Though because of not efficient carbon pricing, bonus has not come in a big way, but at the same time, the benefit which has come to India and the globe is that 31 million ton CO2 has been reduced from the system. Now the second phase has already started. As well, many such government policies have come in, which is motivating companies, businesses to go for reduction in CO2. Now, for our company, the best part is that our philosophy is also to work on low carbon economy. For that purpose, we have created, with the help of Cement Sustainability Initiative Group of WBCSD, low carbon technology roadmap. We have also taken support of IEA, International Energy Agency, and now they have created some targets which are under discussions, that by 2030, what should be the target, by 2050, what should be the target. But whatever targets they have indicated for 2030, our company has already achieved that. So now we are trying to understand that for 2050 target, what should be done. Now the one major challenge, say like our philosophy or vision also says that we have to innovate. So the innovation which is required now for not only cement, but for aluminum, for steel and many other sectors is carbon capturing and its utilization. It's just few projects, few experiments have been done, but this is one source which may bring down CO2 emissions in these sectors maybe by 20%. So for that purpose, industry has to work, academia has to work, financial institutions have to work, governments have to work. Yeah. And this can bring, not only it can capture, but it can utilize also. And that utilization can definitely support various other activities, it can create economic activities. And that's why, like your theme also says, that we have to create opportunities. So and we in our group feels that combating climate change is an opportunity, though of course it would be always a challenge, but at the same time it is an opportunity, and that opportunity we have to capture as early as possible. So we are now committing ourselves that in whatever pseudo way, whatever shadow way we can price carbon, we would like to invest some money on carbon capturing and utilization project. So this is what I talked in COP23 in Bonn also, in fact before UN Secretary General also, and in other forum also, that yes, we are for it. So we are now inviting, we are requesting financial institutions, academicians, R&D institutes, and the governments to work for it.
Great.
So this can sort in a big way the problem of climate change. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I think it comes back to your point, Ulas, too, about creating a group here to look at sort of the solutions. And I wonder, we've started some initial discussions in the CPLC, the Carbon Pricing Coalition, around the construction value chain. And it's not just cement, it's not just metal, it's not just wood. Every material provides a different solution. And what is the carbon intensity of those different solutions? And are there ways to look at the engineering students and the design and sort of what is the low carbon option? What's the role of a price to make that trigger happen? Yeah. So I think we'd like to continue that discussion with all of you. That's a great next step. So Sanjeev, I'll round it out with you. A final question for you. As you say, you put in place the price internally. You're starting to push forward. But I think you probably have the same question that Mr. Singhi does about, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen? I mean, how do you see going from the near term of maximizing efficiency to that more challenging step of really decarbonizing?
Yeah, but whilst I come to that, let me just reiterate that carbon pricing in Tata Steel is fully embedded in all our CapEx evaluation and decision-making processes. It's been rolled out to our subsidiary companies as well. And taking the point that Marina said, going forward, we would also like to take this concept out to our stakeholders, to our suppliers as well as our customers. Being around for more than 100 years, we have a reasonable influence on society as well. Jamshedpur is a city that is managed by Tata Steel itself, and there are plenty of schools that are run there. So taking the concept down to schools, children, the community in general, not just in Jamshedpur, but in the Kalinganagar plant in Odisha, the mines and collieries as well, and that probably would be the next step going forward. On PAT, perform, achieve, and trade, whilst the government has put in some great fora, here I think a lot still needs to happen, because whilst perform and achieve has begun, trade is yet to start. And unless trade starts happening, I don't think this will achieve the kind of target, the kind of scale that we are looking for in mitigation of carbon dioxide. On hydrogen and carbon sequestration, storage, etc., I think the cost of this technology is still not viable, neither for hydrogen, which could be a big mitigator in decarbonizing steel. It could reduce the carbon footprint of steel significantly. But there is no technology available as yet in the world which would bring hydrogen cost to manageable levels, economical levels. So carbon pricing could probably give a leg up to that. And as carbon prices actually increase to the level that Dr. Stern has been talking about, maybe such technologies will become viable.
Yeah.
Same with sequestration and storage. I don't see any technology in sight still which could have an, which is available at an economic value today to store carbon dioxide or sequestrate carbon dioxide. So again, carbon pricing could actually give a leg up to such technologies, research in such technologies, and this could be, the economic opportunities available to new businesses.
Right.
So that is, my view as yet. Neither hydrogen nor storage are economically viable still. The journey on carbon pricing has just begun, and maybe this is globally, and maybe taken more seriously, and as it propagates further, it would give leg up to such technologies which would mitigate carbon going forward.
Great. Mr. Singh, yes.
If I may add, that if any future pricing can be done, maybe for 2030 or 2040 of say $100 or something, and then if that can get evaluated and totaled up of what these new technology of say what he has said about hydrogen or CO2 capturing, and then somebody would find that it can do wonders. And then maybe Green Climate Fund, maybe various governments, various corporates, they can all come together. Then there can be fund of maybe 30-40 billion dollar, and then these technologies can be created.
Right.
There has been experiments in South Korea or in few other places where jobs have been done. But yes, today it's not commercially viable.
Right.
The same thing which happened in solar panels. 5 years back, they were not viable. But in today, with the new technology developments, maybe in China, maybe in Germany, now it's a business as usual.
Right, right. No, so you're talking about sort of what's that market signal to pay, what the price that is going to be required to mitigate those emissions. So that actually brings us to our last question on the poll.
But just, sorry.
Yeah, please.
So it should not be considered just in terms of trade only,
Yes.
but it should be also considered in terms of investment for future.
Right.
Thank you.
No, absolutely. So I think, so let's go to the final question. This is a great way, and then I'm going to ask each panelist just a quick reaction to the poll. So it's what business rationale is most likely to drive the use of an internal carbon price? Oh, I'm sorry, no, it's what is, in your opinion, the most important next step to accelerate climate ambition? So is it government-imposed carbon pricing? Is it other economies in the bigger emitters in the world doing carbon pricing? Other policies or incentives for business, or greater public support for action? So I'm interested to see the responses here. So yeah, why don't I won't respond myself. I'll ask each panelist just to maybe, we're at the sort of the end of our session here, so maybe each of you have final remarks based on what do you think on the discussion you just heard and this poll result. Ulas.
So I want to say two things. First of all, I think government-imposed carbon pricing will probably have the biggest impact, although I think it's extremely important that any government policies have to be predictable and consistent. Otherwise, they cannot really make any positive impact. Because otherwise, businesses will just keep going back and forth and doing things that are not really good for the environment. The other part from an earlier poll that I noticed, that nobody believed that their investors would really make any great difference in how they approach carbon pricing. In our case, I have to say they played a very significant role. The reason we really got thinking about these issues is because some of our investors asked a few questions to us. So I think perhaps that impact has been underrated, at least in this room. And perhaps investors can play a very big role, because a lot of our companies are in the S&P, sustainable index, and or Dow Jones, Dow Jones Sustainable Index, and I feel that these are the kind of things that send signals and allow investors to find companies that they want to invest in.
Great, that's a very good point. Marina, your take on the...
Yeah, I think most of the countries have already committed themselves in the international agreement, the Paris Agreement. Like India and Brazil, we have a very high commitment to reduce carbon pricing. So there is no way back. And like in the case of India, China is almost having a carbon pricing instrument. And as soon as they get this instrument, 25% of the carbon price of the carbon emitted in the world will be covered by some type of carbon pricing instrument. So it's as I said before, it's a irreversible trend, and we have this commitment as a country in the international agreement. So what I found interesting, like one of the companies in Brazil that are involved in this simulation that I mentioned before is a chemical industry, a Brazilian chemical industry. And I was speaking with one of the executives that is involved in this process, and he was explaining how they do this. And it's interesting because there are 5 different phases. So first, to adjust the system, to review the procedure, and then they simulate different scenarios of carbon pricing, putting different prices in each scenario to see which project would be still competitive in the future. And then they aligned the results with the leadership and implemented the internal carbon pricing in the company. And he also mentioned that it's very important to involve the finance team, of course, because they will be involved in all the operation of this carbon pricing. And the 2 main benefits of having this internal simulation for him is to reduce the risk of approving projects with potential future costs, and also to adapt the decision-making process to opportunities to increase competitiveness. So like this Brazilian chemical industry, all the other almost 50 companies that are involved, they are getting prepared for this future policy. As Tom mentioned, the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition is a great place to get involved in the discussion, to learn more how other companies are doing. There's the working group on mobilizing business support with companies from all different sectors and different companies. So it's a very interesting learning process on how they're doing and how the countries are doing. Like in the South America, most of the countries, or all of them, are having taxes, and how the companies are working with this. So it's very interesting. I really recommend you to participate in this group. Also in Brazil, the chemical industry, we are asking for the Brazilian government, when they decide to implement a policy, to implement for all sectors equally. Because if they implement for specific sectors, you can kill the competitiveness of the other, you know? You can finish the competitiveness, because some of the products could be more competitive comparing to the other sectors that are being are having this carbon pricing. So it must be implemented to all sectors, so you can keep the competitiveness of the different sectors in Brazil. At COP23, we helped to organize a visit to ChemPark, which is a industrial park for the chemical sector, and we showed many solutions. And one of the solutions I found very interesting is it's a manufacturing, it's a company that uses carbon, CO2 that is emitted. They bring it back to the production, and they use as raw material. 20% of the production is used with the CO2 that was emitted. I don't know if I was clear.
That's right. No,
but it was very interesting to show to the Brazilian authorities, senators, and deputies how industries can contribute, and how the chemical sector. It's important to involve legislative power as well in this discussion, because they can push for the policies in the executive power. So I think these are my contributions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maria. Ulhas, do you want to add something?
So I just wanted to say, one other area where the government can make a huge difference is using carbon pricing in their own decision-making process. So, for example, they say that a lot of the pollution in Delhi is caused by people burning crops in Punjab. So it's, if the government can use some of the money that they might use for mitigation in Delhi to just pay the farmers not to burn those crops, but, use it for, generating some kind of bio power.
Right.
I think that would be a great solution.
The government use, yeah, I agree with that. And so let's bring us back to Mr. Singhi. Any final reactions to the poll or other thoughts?
Yes, in my view, society and investors, they can play a major role in creating awareness about carbon pricing. The moment society starts paying somewhat more than the normal product, like we produce green cement better than some other cement, steel might be producing the green steel or green aluminum.
Yeah.
So if society starts giving premium to them, then definitely these companies would be interested in pricing the carbon, paying for the carbon. Then they will be motivated to reduce the carbon.
Yep.
So like in India also, now this moment has started. Now if we talk of air conditioners, if we talk of LED bulbs, etc., these things have started. So in my view, investors and society would play a big role in carbon pricing.
Great, thank you very much for that. And Sanjeev, I'll round it out with you. Any final reactions to the?
Yeah, if you could put that slide back again, the poll. But let me begin with what Ulhas said.
Yeah.
I quite agree with him that the financial community, the global financial community, is actually going to be the biggest catalyst to move the needle forward as far as climate change initiatives are concerned. And it's IFC who's hosting this, conference, and I have been to quite a few places now where I see the maximum number of the financial guys who are there and trying to understand what's happening on climate and what needs to be done further. So I quite agree with you, Ulhas, there. Is that slide back?
Can we get the poll up, the final poll results? Is that possible?
Yeah, on the
There we
poll,
go.
I quite agree with what the poll has said, because I think there are a lot of inequities between the developing nations and the developed nations. And India, South Asia would fall in the developing nation side. And I guess a lot of what happens in other parts of the world, because it's a connected world finally, what happens there would determine how far our ambitions on climate go. Because if we do not see, as Professor Stern was saying yesterday, that in the next 20, 25 years, the global economy is going to double. That means double the infrastructure. And most of it is going to come in the developing world. India, Southeast Asia is going to be a major chunk where all of this is going to happen. How can this infrastructure be built without cement and steel, which are big carbon emitters? So what is the world going to do to either allow this, this kind of infrastructure to come up, or to create technologies which will decarbonize steel and cement, and help create infrastructure which will be less carbon intensive. So there are plenty of dynamics that are still playing out, and unless there are structures that evolve in the world wherein these interdependencies are understood a little bit better, I don't think this acceleration in climate emissions will happen.
Right. Well, great. Well, so that wraps up. We're a little bit over time. I apologize we didn't get time for questions, but I think the main points I'm taking away in the short term, it seems like this is a fantastic tool to drive decision-making and to change. We've already seen some great examples on the panel here today. And then the medium to longer term, it seems to me that we need more public-private and sort of academic cooperation, as well as engage in the financial sector and some of these other players, because I think that getting to the point of the transition that's really going to be needed in some of these sectors, it's going to be a higher price, and so a carbon price, to get to those levels, we're going to have that collaboration. So I really, can you join me in a round of applause? Thank you for the panelists, a fantastic discussion today, and we look forward to working with you. I'm glad that all of them were part of our Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, so if you're interested in learning more about that, we'd love to have you join us as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.